What is the difference between a D&D campaign and a story? We are about to find out. Hi, I am writer and artist Dan Finlay, and this is The Story Grind, a show where we look at storytelling so we can become better storytellers. On today's episode, we're taking a look at issue 1 of the comic Unnatural Order from Vault Comics. Story Grind is brought to you by the stories that I make. If you want to follow along on my story writing journey, subscribe to the monthly newsletter where I give monthly updates. Links to both are in the description below. If you really like the show, please like, follow, and subscribe and share with your friends. Your support means a lot. So I first heard about Unnatural Order online through, I don't know if it was a marketing campaign or maybe it was just some news, but they were saying that the first issue was being given away for free. So I ran down to my comic shop only to find out that they were selling it for cover price. So I ended up passing on it at the time, but the concept kind of stuck with me, and it sounded really cool. And it was a few months later where I saw it being sold as a set that I decided to pick it up. And I'm kind of glad I did because it ended up turning out to be a very cool story, which we're going to check out in just a minute. So let's go over the details. We have Unnatural Order, which was published, I believe it was in like June of 2024, but for some reason the indicia says 2023, August 2023, which is sort of strange, but maybe it was supposed to come out earlier, but it just never did. Who knows? But it's 30 pages long, and this series, surprisingly, is only 4 issues long. We'll get into that a little bit later in this video. So here's the creative team. So this first arc is only 4 issues long, which is kind of surprising. It's really hard to pull off a completed story in 4 issues. Most series nowadays are completed in 6 issues, with a trend now moving to 5 issues because, well, I've heard stories where people are profitable in the first 3 issues of a comic series, but lose all those profits after that due to the dwindling sales. So we'll talk a little bit more about that about the 4-issue story arc at the end of this. So I was going to give you the log line for the story right now, but I think we're going to hold off until the end of the video and to talk about it because it gives away some important details. So stick around and we'll discuss the log line a little bit later. So here we go. Scene 1, 3 pages long. Page 1. We're introduced to some Roman soldiers sailing across the sea. The title tells us it's 54 BC, and an unnamed narrator tells us about how they're trying to spread the Roman Empire. On their adventures, they heard of a person called the Prisoner, who has been exiled to an island and who everyone is afraid of. The soldier lands on that island. All right, page 2. The island holds a giant tree, and they've dedicated about a half a page splash to this very strange-looking tree. The Roman soldiers discover the person that everyone has been afraid of, and this person they've nicknamed, if not the Prisoner, they've nicknamed him Druid. So this character actually has a few different names in this story. We hear the narrator's name for the first time, and his name is Valerius. Okay, page 3. The soldier confronts Druid and discovers that the Druid is pulling out the entrails of a person who's still alive, which is pretty gross. Druid says that by coming, they've provided him a way to escape. Valerius demands that Druid face him. There's a twinkle in Druid's eye, and suddenly one of Valerius' colleagues bursts into flames, while the other turns into a tree. So this is our first introduction into some weird cosmic magic in this story. Is this historic fantasy? Still unsure at this point. So in a novel, you might call this a prologue. In a TV show, you might call it a cold open. It gives us a taste of what we're up against because we hear about this villain being talked about a lot in the story, but we don't really see him again for the rest of this first issue. So I think this is really smart because as storytellers, I always feel that we need to establish the cast of characters early on in the story. I really hate it when we see some stories that new characters will just pop up, maybe like at the tail end of the story, out of nowhere. And I think that's sort of a sign of an amateur writer. I think the best writers will kind of introduce their cast early on, and even has some of the characters can fade out, but they'll come back a little bit later, so they're not just coming out of nowhere. Another thing that I really like about this is that we are able now to connect a face to a name, even though this character won't really appear later on in the story. So here's something I wanted to do a little bit differently with this video is really start looking at the levels of conflict in scenes. So this is only a 3-page scene. We've seen the conflict go from good to bad. Even maybe even like neutral to bad. So I'm gonna mark this as a positive to a negative charge in this scene. We started off with the soldiers kind of just looking for somebody. They found that person, and all of a sudden, one of them turned to flames, and the other one turned into a tree. So I would say that's pretty negative. And what we're gonna do is typically, when I look at stories, I'll see that change from positive to negative alternate from scene to scene. Doesn't always match up that way. It really depends on the storyteller and their voice and sort of what feels organic to that story. But we're going to definitely take a look at it in this story. So here we go. Scene 2, 7 pages. And this is going to be an action scene. All right, we're looking at page 4 with the title, Years Later. Sunrise over a forest, and we see a woman being chased by wolves. Page 5, she trips and falls and is cornered by the wolves. The woman prays to her gods, and as the wolves transform into monsters, they say that their gods demand a sacrifice. Page 6, the wolf monsters ask what she wanted by trespassing on their master's land, and she says, which I think is a great line, your attention. And then we get this panel of the wolf monster being shot through the back of the head with the arrow coming out of the mouth. Great panel, great moment. I really enjoyed that. The other wolf monsters turn around to see unbelievers, as they say, off panel. Page 7. We're introduced to our main cast in a splash page. Straight out of a D&D campaign. We have a barbarian, a thief/archer, a Roman soldier, and an Amazon maybe? We hear a new narrator speaking now, and that narrator says, this is not how things are supposed to be. I feel like this is a great use for a splash page. We get to see our characters in the middle of the action, full frame, love it. Page 8, the warriors fight the remaining wolf monsters while the narrator continues. She says that she can feel something unnatural around her. Nature has turned against man. In the very last panel, one of the wolf monsters runs at the woman, whose name we find out is Adrena. Page 9, the other warriors don't have a shot, and the wolf pounces only for Adrena to use her magic and obliterate this wolf monster. I'm a little confused here if the gang of warriors know she's a witch or not, or a magic user or not, because the Roman soldier says witch. The archer is surprised, and the female warrior says, be glad she's on our side, lest those bones be ours. I need to add that I love how the paint-like texture is coming through in these images, but I think the artist draws it by hand. This looks like they're using traditional media, but I have gone to their Instagram and I have seen them drawing in this style like on an iPad. So if they're kind of bringing these textures, drawing these textures by hand with, digitally, I'd say that's pretty amazing mark making. I would love to get like a tutorial on how they're doing this. Okay, page 10. After the action, we get a page of talk. The barbarian named Gunther asks how she did this. The archer tells Gunther to leave her be. They discover that one of the wolves is still alive. So again, I'm not exactly sure if they've just discovered Adrena or if they're just kind of helping her. They saw her running and they decided to come to her aid, or if they've been in this together. So it is still a little confusing at this point, but hopefully that'll clear up as we move along. So the band of D&D characters, you could say, confronts this wolf, and the wolf says that Yodak will find them and kill them all. And again, this is another name for druid or the prisoner that we've seen before. And I think that's kind of interesting that within, 9-10 pages, we've had 3 names for one of the bad guys in the story. So I'll say, when you introduce 3 different names for one character, there is sort of a danger of readers confusing that. I think it's kind of a bold move. And as with most bold moves, it only really is successful if the reader understands it. And luckily for this story, I totally connected the dots on all three names to this one character. So I'd say it was pulled off pretty well. So I'll say this, I am a bit of a fantasy geek. I like the sword and sorcery bits a lot. I really like how the Roman soldiers kind of puts a different take on what is typically a D&D trope of the barbarian, the witch, the archer. It just adds a little bit of a different spin for me. Maybe that's pretty typical in other type of fantasy stories, but I don't see sort of the historical mashup with that fantasy storytelling very often. I'll also add that the drawing style is really great here, and I think it really captures some nice horror moments. So let's take a look at the conflict in scene 2. The overall story started at a negative, with a woman being chased or in jeopardy, and ended with, well, I should say a battle happened, and it ended with the main characters succeeding over this level of jeopardy. So I'd say this scene goes from a negative to a positive in scene 2. So here we go. Scene 3, 1 page long, and this is page 11. So Adrena's narration continues as we watch a little travel interlude of the characters crossing a landscape at night. She says in a vision, she saw this world transformed by an evil she couldn't comprehend, and she was called to this place, and she names it the Deadlands. She's made allies with these people who are affected by the Druid. Now, I still am unclear as to whether or not she's made friends with these people in the moment, or she made friends with them before the wolf started chasing her. But at this point in the story, it doesn't really matter, I guess. They're just a team of warriors searching for the Druid. So Octavius is a Roman soldier, and he is different than the one we saw in the opening scene. She says he was a leader before these dark times. Caden, a thief from Hibernia, whose people were the first to fall to Yodak, a.k.a. the Druid, a.k.a. the prisoner. Yadgid? I don't really know how to say this character's name, so I'm just going to call her Edie from now on. So Edie, the warrior woman, is Britain. Her home is destroyed by Yodak as well. And Gunther, the barbarian, who's there for bloodlust. I really like these brief character intros. The characters already fit into a very comfortable fantasy trope, like soldier, thief, barbarian, magic user, etc. So to hear just a little bit more about them, even through narration, helps me to empathize with them just a little bit. But again, this is narration, so you don't really get the full level of empathy. It's just sort of the quick snippet to kind of get people on board. So we get a nice character joke on this page, and the team is telling Gunther to get rid of the wolf's head from his axe blade. He plays it off as him showing no fear, but Edie tells everyone the truth. He can't get the head off his axe. It's actually stuck there. The team laughs. This is a really nice counterpoint to what we just saw in the previous scene. People are getting along and laughing. I think it's important to show that sometimes characters aren't always business, but sometimes having fun. And that, I think that's always like a great balance, and really sort of helps me as a reader get into the story a little bit more. So even though the scene was only 1 page, there is a bit of conflict here. Even though it isn't the big sort of outsider, out of one's control type of conflict, it's more of a social, personal conflict between the team dynamic. So we have this moment where Gunther is being told by the other team to take this head off his axe, and he refuses to, only to admit that he can't get it off, which I think takes this from a negative at the beginning of the scene to a positive at the end of the scene. So negative to positive charge in this scene in the sort of social, personal conflict arena. Okay, here we go. Scene 4 is only 2 pages long. We have page 12. Now the team is settled around the campfire for the night, and we hear Caden's experience with Yodak. Yodak killed his brother and his entire village, and he swore to kill Yodak. So we have a team of people who have a single objective in mind. They're already on mission, but this is the ordinary world for these characters. We haven't quite seen an inciting incident yet. Octavius asks Caden what were his brothers' names. Page 13, Caden says he can see their faces, but he can't remember their names. Very strange. But Edie says that Yodak uses dark magic to cloud their minds and make them forget what they are fighting for. Really interesting. Edie asks Octavius about what he lost, and he says too much. She says even though he's invaded her lands, she would still sleep with him right now. I think this is supposed to be a joke. Not quite sure. The moment is interrupted as they discover a three-headed worm flying above them. Sort of a strange way to end a scene. I think this is an interesting technique, though, and you'll see this writer as well as many other writers using it, especially when you have to, or when you have a dialogue scene that you need to end. Bringing in like an action moment at the end of a dialogue scene is a great way to cut that conversation short. It's not working so well in this scene though, and it feels a little awkward, but the writer will use it again later in the issue and it'll work much better. I think the issue here is that there really isn't any conflict in this scene. We're just having a conversation to get information out there, and I'm not sure it's even any new information because we've already had these characters and we got a little snippet of their lives, which have all been ruined by this Yodak character. The only really new bit of information we get in this moment is Edie saying Yodak uses dark magic to make them forget. It's a really strange scene, and I wonder why the creative team decided to leave it in there. It's almost like the previous scene did such a good job of encapsulating their backstories that we really didn't need this one. Or I would have suggested blending the two scenes together and letting the Gunther's axe joke run until the end of this scene. But yeah, sort of the worm flying through just feels like a strange interjection into this moment to kind of give some level of suspense or jeopardy into what is kind of a flat scene. So we'll take a look actually at the dynamics of this. It's only 2 pages long. It starts with them sort of in conversation, but kind of ends with them discovering a worm flying above them and putting a fire out. So I'll say that's a negative. So it goes from like a positive charge to a negative charge, even though it's not a great use of conflict, I would say. All right, moving on to the next scene, which is scene 5 and is 7 pages long. All right, page 14, we get a title that says Londinium under Druid Rule. We see a town filled with thatch-roofed buildings. The gang is sneaking through the city with hooded cloaks. They're there to meet an informant. On page 15, the team is in a tavern, drinking and mingling. The narrator, Adriana, says that they know their deaths are inevitable, and they cling tightly to life. Adriana says she wants to be as free as the rest, but she can't because she doesn't remember. Again, sort of this interesting idea of people losing their memory in this sort of strange fantasy/historical mashup. So Adriana sees someone in the tavern, and it's their informant. So let's take a look at this last panel on this page, which I think is a strange artistic choice. Usually white brings things to the foreground, but here it's being used to reverse silhouette characters in the background. And I wonder if this was meant to be colored but was mistakenly omitted. Because I don't think putting background characters in white like this actually works. It brings too much attention to them. And these characters don't seem to be important right now. Maybe if they had white silhouetted all of the characters except for the informant entering the room, it would have been a little bit stronger. Page 16. The informant tells the group that he's discovered a prisoner that the druid fears. This prisoner has been taken to the burning fields. Some of the group think this is interesting because if the druid fears the prisoner, that must mean there's some value to him. But the rest of the group thinks that this is not really that interesting and they want the information that they've actually paid this informant for. So the informant gives them that information, which is he's found this tree that they've desperately been looking for. And it's pretty easy to assume that this tree is that giant tree we saw on the island in the opening scene. Page 17, and if that wasn't enough of a tip, we actually see that giant tree at the first third of this page, sort of bleeding out across the edge. And then we hear the informant tell us or tell these characters where the tree is, and it's a 2 days travel, and it's sitting on an island. It is the same tree that we saw in the very first scene. Adriana says that she has dreamt that this tree is the source of the druid's power. The group decides to split up. 3 will go to see the tree, and 2 will go to rescue the prisoner, who they think might be valuable. Before they can argue about it, though, the room turns red. Page 18, the rest of the scene is action. So we'll highlight that in orange. The tavern is torn apart by some large tree creatures, and I think the informant is impaled by one of the creatures, but I'm not positive. Page 19, we get into a splash page, and we see the creatures in full. Giant. These aren't just tree creatures. These are giant tree creatures that are tearing the roof apart. And Adriana voices her doubts when confronted with such evil. So another great use of the splash page here. Very cool looking monsters on display. This is what a splash page is meant for. You just got some cool creatures, a decent composition, some action happening. Again, this is the second really nice splash page in this first issue. Page 20, the team races to their horses, and Adriana sets the tree creatures on fire. So these last 3 pages didn't add much to the story besides a convenient interruption to their conversation and something to motivate them to leave the town. The creatures still look cool, though. Now, is getting the news of the prisoner the inciting incident of this story? I don't think so. The characters are still on mission. The prisoner is just a distraction, really, at this point. So let's look at the dynamics of this scene. So we start off with them entering the town, going to a tavern, having fun and partying and waiting for an informant. And the scene ends with them being attacked by giant creatures kind of out of nowhere. So I would say that's pretty easily a positive to negative charge for this scene. Okay, now we're into scene 6, which is 10 pages long. Page 21. We get a title which says The Cardiff Ruins. So the team splits up. Gunther and Edie go to find the prisoner. Octavius, Caden, and Adriana go to find the tree. So we're going to see the scene cut back and forth between the 2 teams. So I'm going to highlight one team in white and the other team in sort of a pinkish color. So at the end of page 21, the teams split up. Page 22, we cut back and forth between the 2 teams. I'll call this one Team Prisoner, and they are represented by white pages. So as Team Prisoner rides, Gunther asks what Yodak did to Edie. And she says that he killed her sister and destroyed her village. So we're getting another point of empathy for another character. Since we've got 5 characters, we only get a very brief point of empathy for each of these characters. And, it's not a very deep point of empathy. They've all pretty much had their villages destroyed by Yodak. And I think this is sort of the trade-off with having 5 characters versus a single hero journey. You only get you only have so much time to get insight into these characters, and it's just going to be a quick snippet. And I think the other thing that sort of hamstrings this a little bit is that they're all, not only do they all have the same story, but we already know this information. We already know Yodak has done something to all of them. And it's strange that all these characters have had almost the exact same thing done to them. Now, in some stories, I would sit there and say, like, oh, okay, this is intentional. But I've read the rest of this story, and it doesn't really add any value. Even sort of when the twists are revealed, I feel like these empathetic moments could have been a little more fine-tuned than they are right now, instead of sort of this generic, I had my life destroyed by Yodak moments. All right, we're on page 23, and we're back with Team Tree. They're sailing to the island and know that they have arrived when they discover a skeleton in the water. Page 24 and 25, we're back with Team Prisoner. This is our very first double-page splash of the book, as Gunther and Edie arrive at the burning fields. Edie says that the druid takes prisoners and burns them as a sacrifice because he likes to kill. So far, I've loved the splash pages in this book. But I gotta be honest, I don't know why this is a double page splash. It feels like it shouldn't be more than a quarter page, or to me at the very least, maybe a half page. but it's basically an establishing shot. I mean, sure, there's an interesting image here, but I don't think it has the weight of the other splash pages, and definitely not for a double page splash. It kind of feels like a bit of a waste of real estate to me. Okay, page 26, and we are still with Team Prisoner. The page is kind of confusing as Edie stabs a random person who's standing in the burning fields. I think they're a guard, maybe. Then she's wearing a cloak as a disguise, possibly. As they run through the burning fields, they run past Wolf eating a prisoner. Page 27. Team Tree lands on the island. They reiterate that they are here to burn the tree down because it is the presumed source of the druid's power. Adriana says that there's something wrong. Page 28. They find the tree and it is already dead. There definitely is something wrong. So at the last sort of quarter of this page, I'd say the last third of this page, we kind of go back to almost sort of a strange transition back to the burning plains with Team Prisoner, and we get this little narration caption from Adriana, which is, "This is not how things are supposed to be." All right, page 29. Team Prisoner fights their way to the prisoner and cuts their way into one of these wicker statues. Page 30. We get a full page splash with some inset panels, and we see the prisoner for the very first time, and he's wearing a modern military trooper's uniform. Another great use of the splash page. This is a really important moment in the story, and this is really who the story revolves around. So this is our inciting incident of the story. But there's something interesting going on here, in that it doesn't really upset the balance of the character's world like an inciting incident should, ultimately because they're seeing a guy in a strange outfit. But it does upset the balance of the reader's world because this whole story has been set up as a fantasy story / historical story. And to see a guy in a modern day military fatigues completely breaks with our expectations. I think it's a really nice surprise. A very similar thing happened in the video I did on Little Bird. But for Little Bird, it was a cliffhanger, sort of suspense ending at the end of the first issue. While in this story, it's actually the inciting incident. So let's look at the conflict dynamics in this scene. We have at the beginning a very positive, where the team is, pretty safe. They are about to embark on their separate journeys. They do hit some bumps in the road on the way there, and it ends with sort of a big question mark, which is who is sort of a suspense moment, cliffhanger ending, which is supposed to bring you back for the second issue. So I'll just go from positive to question mark for this scene. Okay, so that's the end of the very first issue of Unnatural Order. Let's step back and take a 10,000-foot view of the story and all the scenes. So we have 6 scenes in total, and as you can see, each scene kind of alternates between positive and negative charges. I think probably the weakest point of the story is probably scene 3 and scene 4, which probably should have been combined. But beyond that, I think this is a really interesting story in that it sets you up to read a fantasy story and ends with sort of a modern day suspense ending where you realize this is not going to be your typical fantasy story, which is a lot of fun. So I'll tell you, when I first read this, I kind of already knew that there was sort of a modern day aspect to the story because I had read the logline beforehand, which we will get to in just a minute. But when I started reading, I kept thinking, like, when is this sort of modern day aspect going to come into play? And then there had been so much time since I had read the original logline to when I actually picked the story up that I thought, oh, maybe I got confused about the logline. Maybe I read something, a logline to a different story, and this is just a fantasy story. So at some point, I just leaned into the fantasy aspect. So when I hit this ending, I actually was surprised, and it was a really nice surprise. And I'll tell you, when I saw this, I'm like, oh, I'm on board for the future issues because this is a really cool twist to what could have been a kind of tepid D&D story, right? So let's get into that log line a little bit, and you kind of see what I was saying about as far as the logline spoils the story a little bit. Actually, not a little bit, a lot. First, I have to give a huge shout out and a thanks to Vault for putting the logline on the back of the book. Man, the first thing I do when I pick up any book or comic is I flip to the back to kind of see what the story is about. And there are so many comics at a comic shop where I flip to the back and there's just a waste of space there. There's no description, there's no log line, there's nothing. It's not even like, sometimes it's not even like a piece of pinup art. It's just, you're just kind of left to wonder what the story is about. And I think if you're one of those readers who doesn't like stay in touch with the latest comic news, like that is such a valuable piece of real estate that is being wasted. Please, people, put the logline on the back of your book so people know what the story is about. Not everybody buys based on cool art. So, again, huge shout out to Vault for doing this, and Unnatural Order does it right. So here is the logline. After the fall of the Britons and the Roman invasion of Hibernia, the captive known only as the Druid is released, sending a darkness across the world, an age of horrors, of fire, and entrails. As the innocent burn in the wicker fields, those who resist learn of the existence of a man who even the Druid fears. For it is this prisoner, a soldier from a different time, who alone knows the Druid's secret. This is not how the world is supposed to be. Okay, so that's the log line, and you see that there is a very important part in the story, which is the discovery of this prisoner from another time. So it does kind of give the story away a little bit. I think they are really creative in kind of saying that it's not a modern day soldier in fatigues, like it is on the very final splash page of this issue. I think that's a very smart move, but at the same time, it's strange. When I first heard about this story, I heard about things about like scientists and CERN and stuff like that, but I actually don't see that in the logline. So I must have read maybe some type of, I don't know if it was a review or maybe a different kind of summary that sort of told me about that. But that's sort of what I was expecting. I was expecting scientists and CERN to appear in this story somewhere, and it never did until the very end. All right, so let's talk about how this story is only 4 issues long. So I'm not seeing many stories wrapping up a whole story arc in 4 issues. Usually it's 5 or 6. So how does this series wrap up a whole story in only 4 issues when the inciting incident happens at the end of issue 1 on page 30? Well, to put it simply, it doesn't. Unfortunately, at the end of the series, we're left with a cliffhanger ending. The objectives of the characters are kicked down the road a little bit further, and ultimately the ending was kind of unsatisfying to me. But I will still read future issues if they ever come out. The thing is, I haven't really heard if there will be another volume or not, and I'm not sure how well the book did financially, but if you pick this up, don't expect it to be wrapped up by the end of the first arc. So doing a satisfying ending in 4 issues is incredibly hard. Still worth reading though, because the writer is doing some really interesting things with the dynamics of the team by the end of this first story arc, where we see some of the friends become enemies, and that's always sort of a story trope that I've loved. And so it's going to be interesting to see their journey. I feel like it's going to start kind of peel away from the outside conflict of these guys versus the big bad, and it's going to become more of a frenemies type of dynamic, which I think almost sort of leans more into like a television type of storytelling as opposed to maybe like a feature film type of storytelling. One of my final notes is about the narration in the story. It plays a very big part of the story, and is a big reason why we're able to cover so much in such a short amount of time, especially with only 6 scenes. I thought this story had a great balance between narration and dialogue. Really, really well done. I didn't get too tired of the narration. I thought dialogue came in just at the right moments. Um, the visual differences between narration boxes is really subtle, and is actually being represented by a colored box on the side of the caption. And actually, I think we have at least two narrators in this story. And I think when you have different narrators and your differentiating feature of their narration box is just like a little slab of color, I think it's really easy to get confused. So I think as a future tip to myself when I'm doing lettering, make the caption boxes a little more distinct so that we know that different people are talking. That's probably the only tip that I would take away from this story in particular. The only other sort of criticism I have about this story is one that I've actually pointed out before, is that we're getting repeated information when I feel like it could have given us some new information instead of sort of wasting that real estate. It would have been a great opportunity to give us a little bit more insight into some characters. Maybe not hearing that Yodak has killed their family twice in the story, especially when it doesn't really mean that much in the end. Maybe something that gives them a little bit more personality. But, it's hard to say in hindsight. Maybe it's easier to say in hindsight and a little bit harder to do when you're in the moment. But at the same time, I think that's something that I'm going to definitely look out for in my own writing, is to make sure that I create unique moments instead of repeating moments. So what did you think about Unnatural Order #1? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Is the fantasy part blending with history and a modern day character working for you? Let me know. And definitely share this with your friends. Like, follow, subscribe. Let's get more people involved in the storytelling community so we can all become better storytellers. That's it for the Story Grind. I will see you next week.